Greetings and welcome to the Dr. J vlog series. It is Sunday, November 2nd, 2025, and on Sundays we talk about the purpose and meaning of life and how life goes on, even though the Blue Jays lost a heartbreaking extra inning Game 7 in the World Series. So the truly awakened and enlightened person must look beyond the conventional religious systems to get to the meaning and purpose of life, I think, ultimately. The religions can be helpful guides, to be sure, but a problem arises if we cling too tenaciously to just one specific interpretation or of our particular faith, and especially if that appears to privilege one group of people over all others. And based on what exactly? The fact that the religious adherents had the good fortune to be born into a specific culture and at a point in history when God smiled upon their kind? That reasoning never really made sense to me, even as a young child. That is, that somehow only certain people were God's chosen people, or that, raised as a Christian, that somehow we had the good news and we were right, and everyone else needed to learn what we already knew. And then by extension, then that only certain people were going to be ascending into heaven, or granted a life everlasting, etc. And you're, of course, free to believe that, or your specific, whatever your religion teaches you, or whatever you might want. I simply view the world and our place in the cosmos rather differently these days. I think the faith traditions and religion in general have some important things to say about all of this, but I've never really seen the value in pitting one religion against the other or claiming the superiority of my religion and so on. Instead, I've always kind of valued the common threads and the deep wisdom that each has to offer. The universal aspects, in my view, have to do with the bending of ourselves for the light that we all see around us. And there's something I think that we all see in each of ourselves, or that we recognize as a light. And at the most fundamental level, of course, we are all nothing but energy and light. But for many, many reasons, some genetic, some linked to our survival mechanisms, and mostly because of our cultural exposures, we can often find ourselves turning away from the light and living lives, if you will, in the extreme darkness. We even have an expression, don't we, as when we say that in our darkest moments, we struggled to see a way out. We struggled to see the light at the end of the tunnel. And to varying degrees, we come to realize that there are people in our lives too, sometimes our most intimate relationships, that who pull us away from the light, or who cloud our judgment, or who directly aim to hurt us and our very souls. And most of us, quite naturally, feel some repulsion, might even wish to avoid such people, especially if they're directly harming us, right? Or we just feel them depleting us or draining us of our positive energy. But even in our more mundane, our everyday lives, we're usually surrounded by people who are, if not actively, aiming to hurt us, obviously, they're generally asleep. And what I mean by that, they're not fully awakened in terms of their own spiritual enlightenment, and that includes yours truly. So what am I saying? I'm definitely not the most enlightened person or the most awake person around, shall we say. I cannot and do not claim any special abilities or status. I'm merely committed to trying to be more awake in my life. I try not to judge others too much, or especially if they're in different places in their journey. But nor do I simply sit idly by and allow others to push me into darkness or chaos or despondency. And neither should you. You don't have to oblige the energy vampires out there, those who are foisting certain ideas upon you because only they know the truth and you just need to get in line. I think a genuinely enlightened person would never tell you that that's who they are. Rather, it'll emerge from the steady stream of their thoughts and their words and their compassion and their actions. An enlightened person chooses to live more consciously, to be awake, rather than merely sleepwalking. They recognize the importance of pursuing deeper truths, that lie at the heart of our existence. And that often requires disconnecting from those sources and perhaps certain individuals who are intent upon tearing you down or otherwise blocking out the sun and the light from nourishing you. And that can take the form, too, of your own habits and beliefs that keep you trapped in vicious cycles and the chains from which we can never break free. It can be the stories of trauma that we remind ourselves of, and in terms of what we've experienced, and then convincing ourselves that we can never overcome the permanent damage that's been done. It can be in the form of alcohol or drug addictions or compulsive behaviors or gambling or 1,000 other things that cloud our judgment and direct our energies in destructive ways. And at some point, you may come to realize then that there are, in fact, certain places and spaces that are actually hindering your progression, that are an utter waste of time and energy. So, for example, I found this to be the case in certain aspects of my university job, what I do for a living. I've made a concerted effort then to remove myself or disengage from some people and some elements in my job that I've found to be quite draining and unproductive over the years, or they're filled with gossip and negativity. And it's the idea of basically getting sucked into the dramas, or I should say, avoiding getting sucked into those dramas of their plays and deciding not to play your particular part, shall we say. But it doesn't have to be in your work environment. In fact, you can do an environmental scan and identify the various sources of your discomfort or that which might be leaving you trapped or like feeling like you're trapped or stunted in your growth or otherwise basically unable to advance to a more enlightened state. And again, you don't have to make any grand announcements in this regard. You don't have to convey that you're somehow superior to those whom you're now moving away from. You're choosing a different path, perhaps. Rather, you're just awakening to the fact that you're no longer going to be playing their particular game or acting a certain part in their drama. I don't begrudge others, their sense of success, their feelings of fulfillment, and so on. It's just that I've long realized that a lot of what we pursue is just, and maybe you know this too, I think we all do at some level, a lot of what we pursue is so superficial, right? Like our appearances and making money and these sorts of things. These are the performances. These are ways that are playing a part that just kind of feed our egos. And it's absolutely critical to try to let that go. And sometimes then that means actually moving away from others who are trapped in their play, the play of their own lives. And these are basically, again, the people who are just, essentially seeking the attention for themselves, their validation, they're feeding their own egos. And again, they're doing this not because they're necessarily bad or evil people or whatever. We're all, people. But it's just that they often have a much more superficial or narrow understanding of life's meaning and purpose. And so, for example, you'd obviously move away from or disengage or avoid altogether someone who's directly intent upon harming you, right, or robbing you or pointing a gun at you. But why? Well, for obvious reasons. But the deeper point is that they're obviously not enlightened people, right? Very, very few people would actively want to live in that kind of a world or surrounded by those kinds of people. Doesn't make any sense. And beyond the obvious, then there are many situations that might involve disengagement from people you might have once been very close to, or those who are sort of trapped in the superficiality of the play and the performance. Or you find yourself moving away because the relationship that you had was almost certainly built or based upon an earlier and perhaps a much different version of yourself, and you're no longer that person. What I mean? Well, so for example, I had an old friend contact me recently, hoping to reconnect, and that's a sweet gesture to be sure. But the language and the tone and some of the information shared with me provided ample evidence that the person was kind of sleepwalking in their own life and trapped in their own past, shall we say. And so how do you explain to someone that while you were once friends and shared some good times and memories, that you're no longer that person, that you're much more awake now, for example. Again, it doesn't make you better. You're not superior to that person, but rather you're in a different place. And in that sense of being enlightened, it doesn't really make sense to reconstruct the past and how things once were any more than you'd go back to, dating your old, your old high school flame or what have you. That ship has sailed. And so instead, think about this person then who contacted me. Well, I looked a bit at their social media posts, and indeed that confirmed that we no longer had much in common at all. We speak very vastly different life languages. We live in quite different worlds, shall we say. And I just don't have an interest in returning to my childhood friendships, at least if they're built upon what we were 50 years ago. That makes no sense. And so instead, I do have an idea then about this pathway towards enlightenment. And so for argument's sake, let's suggest or imagine that they're each going to live exactly 100 years, right? That we'd be so lucky. And so in that first year, of course, we're entirely dependent upon others for our survival. We haven't acquired language and so on. Would you say that you're enlightened at that time or at your early stage in life? No, I don't believe so. Not for, nearly all of us, any of us. We're just at the start of our journey. And even if we say that, well, children are innocent, let's not conflate innocence with enlightenment. And I think that we then gradually become more enlightened in time, perhaps at least metaphorically with each passing year, ideally. If we lived until 100, we could say that at age 10, for example, that we were perhaps only 10% along in our journey, obviously in terms of our age and our mortality, but also maybe just about 10% of our full capacity of becoming and being enlightened. But of course, that's not literally true, and we're not static beings either. There are times when we're clearly more aware and awake and enlightened along the way, even at our young age, whatever that might be. And then at other times, we sort of fall back or we regress and we sort of get attracted to the darkness. And so, again, I like using age as a metaphor for our level of enlightenment, if you will. So I'm 63, and you could say that I'm almost 2/3 of my way through that 100 years, right? But I'm also only 63% of the way there in terms of enlightenment. Not literally, but you get the point. And so upon reaching 100, I'd ideally be 100% fully enlightened and ready to be one with the universe and so on. But why not sooner? Well, some people are obviously much more enlightened and much earlier in their lives, including perhaps most of us at one time or another. Again, it's just that my metaphor implies a statistical average. And even though I mostly, for example, act my age, there are times when I'm not as enlightened either. In a bad moment, I might even act childish or childlike at times. No cap. And yet other times I might actually be extremely enlightened and approaching that 100% maximum of pure light, shall we say. And thus we'll all have our ups and downs along the way. But if we're intent upon waking up from the dream and living a truly enlightened existence, then we'll see that there are times too when we can be much further along, right? Can you also see, by the same token, that there are times when we might regress and not be our best selves? Just to be fair. But ideally, we're going to be making strides forward in our journey. It's just rather foolhardy to imagine that we're all somehow at the same place. And so once you've climbed higher and progressed further, you're more apt to be able to see farther and to see things that others perhaps cannot, at least not at this moment. Again, it's not that you're superior to anyone or everyone else. You're just standing at a different place, on a higher perch, perhaps. It can be hard to tell sometimes exactly what it's like to be at this new place in your life. How do you convey this to others, what the view is like, and so on? And yet you can't go back either. And so that's why spiritual seekers, in my view, often have to seek solitude, in a convent or in the woods or on the ocean or what have you, in meditation or by themselves. It's hard to be truly enlightened while being sucked into the dramas of everyday life, or the superficial pursuits like, one's looks, or making money, especially feeding our egos. Ah, yes, our egos. That's kind of the nub of the matter. We all have them. We all have a sense of self. And yet, most importantly, we have to recognize that it's our egos and the egos of the others who surround us that put us into conflict, that divert us from a path of enlightenment. And so in my next vlog on this particular issue, I'm going to share why I think it's the case and what we can do about it in terms of our egos. So in short, I'd like to share some thoughts about, I think, how we can transcend the self and our egos as we pursue true enlightenment. Okay, so until next time, may you and yours continue to create peace in your lives and nurture love in your hearts and dole out hugs in abundance. Peace.